Number 1. The toxic smoke of Dura-Europos. The year is 256 AD. You're a Roman soldier stationed at Dura-Europos, a fortress city guarding the empire's eastern frontier. The Persian army has surrounded the walls. For weeks you've heard digging beneath your feet. The enemy is tunneling under the city, trying to collapse the walls from below. Your commanders order a counter-tunnel. You and your unit dig toward the enemy, weapons ready, expecting hand-to-hand combat in total darkness. You never get the chance to fight. In 2009, archaeologist Simon James of the University of Leicester re-examined the remains found in that tunnel decades earlier. The same bodies discovered back in 1932. Here's what the bones revealed. The Roman soldiers didn't die from Persian blades. Their bodies were found stacked in a formation that suggested something else entirely. They collapsed almost simultaneously, in a space too narrow for a coordinated attack. James proposed a theory that changed how historians understood ancient siege warfare. The Persians, he argued, ignited a mixture of sulfur crystals and bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance found in the region, directly in the tunnel entrance. When burned, this mixture produces toxic gas capable of killing a person in less than a minute. The Romans, digging toward the enemy in a confined underground space, would have had nowhere to escape. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part is that this may be the earliest confirmed use of chemical warfare in human history, nearly 1,700 years before the trenches of World War I. And here's the question nobody has fully answered. How did a 3rd century Persian army know that burning sulfur and bitumen in a confined space would produce a lethal gas cloud? This wasn't a lucky accident. This was a calculated, engineered kill zone. Someone understood chemistry well enough to weaponize air itself. Consider what that actually required. Someone had to know that sulfur, when burned, releases sulfur dioxide gas. Someone had to know that bitumen, thick, tar-like, slow burning, would sustain that reaction long enough to fill a confined space. And someone had to understand, before modern chemistry existed in any recognizable form, that a narrow tunnel would trap that gas rather than let it disperse. That's not folklore. That's applied science. Simon James's analysis, published through the University of Leicester, went further than most historians expected. He noted the position of the bodies, clustered, some on top of each other, as if the men had tried to retreat and simply hadn't made it. No blades were found buried in bone, no trauma consistent with a sword fight in the dark. Just 20 men, and a chamber that killed all of them in what was likely under a minute. Here's the open question that still lingers over Dura-Europos today. The tunnel network beneath the city was extensive, far larger than the single passage that was excavated in the 1930s. Only a fraction of it has ever been explored, which means somewhere beneath a dead city on the Syrian border, there may be more sealed passages, more chambers, possibly more evidence of a weapon so effective the Romans never saw it coming. And this wasn't the last time toxic smoke would appear in ancient warfare. It shows up again later on this list, used by an empire that perfected the art of chemical fire for nearly 1,000 years. Number 2. Sulfur in the siege tunnels. The year is 189 BC. You're inside a siege tunnel beneath the fortress of Ambracia in modern-day Greece. You can hear muffled voices above. The defenders know the attackers are coming from below. And they've prepared something. According to the Roman historian Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, the defenders of besieged cities developed a defense that turned enemy tunnels into death traps. They filled containers with feathers and sulfur, then set them alight and pushed them into the tunnels using long iron pipes. The smoke that filled the enclosed tunnel space was thick, acrid, and, crucially, heavier than air. It didn't rise and dissipate. It sank, pooling exactly where attacking soldiers were crouched underground. Here's where the mystery deepens. This wasn't a one-time desperate measure. Vitruvius describes it as a known, documented defensive tactic, something engineers were expected to understand. That means ancient military architects weren't just building walls, they were designing chemical defense systems into the very structure of their cities. Researchers at the University of Oxford, studying ancient siege warfare records, have noted that sulfur combustion was understood by ancient engineers well enough to be used repeatedly across different conflicts hundreds of years apart. But here's what still isn't clear. We don't know how many of these tunnels remain unexcavated. We don't know how many ancient battlefields still contain sealed chambers where soldiers died from gas, not blades. And we don't know exactly how ancient engineers first discovered this effect, whether through battlefield trial and error or something else entirely. There's a detail in Vitruvius's writing that's easy to miss but worth sitting with. He wasn't recording a legend. He was writing a technical manual, instructions for military engineers, describing sulfur smoke defense the same way he described how to build an aqueduct or reinforce a wall. That means chemical warfare wasn't treated as taboo in the ancient world. It was treated as engineering, and if it was common enough to appear in a technical manual, historians argue it likely wasn't limited to the handful of sieges we happen to have records for. For every documented use of sulfur gas in a tunnel, there may be dozens that were never written down. Battles lost to time, cities whose names we no longer know, soldiers who died underground with no historian present to record why. The full extent of ancient chemical siege warfare may still be buried beneath modern cities, waiting to be found. But sulfur wasn't the only substance ancient warriors weaponized. Some cultures didn't need fire or smoke at all. They used something that could kill with a single scratch. Number 3. Scythian poisoned arrows. The year is roughly 400 BC. You're a Scythian warrior on the steppes of Central Asia, preparing your arrows before battle. You're not just sharpening the tips, you're dipping them into a dark, foul-smelling paste, a mixture your people have refined for generations. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates wrote about this substance directly. He described a poison called Scythicon, reportedly made by Scythian archers using a combination of snake venom, human blood, and decomposing organic matter, left to putrefy for an extended period before being applied to arrowheads. Here's where it gets strange. Even a minor wound from one of these arrows, a graze, not a fatal shot, could cause a slow, agonizing death. Ancient sources describe wounds that wouldn't heal, infections that spread uncontrollably, and deaths that came days after the original injury. Modern toxicologists who have studied Hippocrates' description believe the mixture likely combined bacterial toxins from decomposition with actual snake venom, creating a compound far more dangerous than either substance alone. This means Scythian warriors, more than 2,000 years ago, had developed something startlingly close to modern biological weaponization, combining a toxin with a delivery mechanism designed to maximize infection and delay death. But here's the unanswered question. We don't have a single surviving sample of Scythicon. We don't know its exact formula. Everything we know comes from second-hand descriptions written by outsiders, Greek physicians and historians who observed the effects but weren't given the recipe. The Scythians left no written language behind. Their knowledge of poison-making died with them, deliberately or otherwise. Which means an entire ancient civilization possessed a weapon devastating enough for Greek doctors to document it in medical texts, and we still don't know exactly how they made it. There's a reason this matters beyond the battlefield. Hippocrates is considered the father of Western medicine. When a physician of his stature takes the time to document a foreign poison in clinical detail, the symptoms, the progression, the failure of wounds to heal, it tells you the Greeks weren't dismissing Scythicon as barbarian myth. They were studying it as a genuine medical threat. Modern archaeologists excavating Scythian burial sites across the steppes of modern-day Ukraine and Kazakhstan have recovered arrowheads with residue too degraded to fully analyze, organic traces that could be consistent with the ancient accounts, but nothing conclusive enough to reconstruct the formula. So the mystery holds. A weapon documented by one of history's most respected physicians, a civilization skilled enough to industrialize its production, and a formula that vanished so completely that 25 centuries of archaeology still hasn't recovered it. Poison, it turns out, was just the beginning. Some ancient armies didn't dip their weapons in venom. They used the animals themselves. Number 4. Pots filled with venomous snakes. The year is 184 BC. You're aboard a warship in the Mediterranean, part of the fleet commanded by Hannibal of Carthage, now an exile serving the king of Bithynia in a naval war against Pergamon. Your fleet is outnumbered, outgunned. On paper, you shouldn't win this battle, but Hannibal has a plan that has nothing to do with ships or soldiers. According to the ancient historian Cornelius Nepos, Hannibal ordered his men to collect as many venomous snakes as they could find, then seal them inside clay pots. As the battle began, his ships closed with the enemy fleet, and instead of firing arrows or launching boarding parties, his men hurled the pots directly onto the decks of enemy ships. The pots shattered on impact. Live, venomous snakes spilled across the decks of Pergamon's fleet. Here's the psychological detail historians find most fascinating. It wasn't just the snake bites that mattered, it was the panic. Sailors trapped on a moving ship, suddenly surrounded by venomous snakes with nowhere to retreat, broke formation entirely. Soldiers abandoned their weapons. Discipline collapsed. Hannibal's forces won the battle, not through superior firepower, but through a single, terrifying tactical decision that turned an entire ecosystem into a weapon. But this is where the mystery deepens. Ancient sources don't specify exactly which species of snake Hannibal's men used. Were they selected for lethality, or simply for how terrifying they looked? Historians studying this event have pointed out that Hannibal may have understood something modern military strategists take very seriously, that fear itself can be a weapon more effective than the thing being feared. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar tactics, using animals, insects, and natural hazards as weapons of psychological warfare, appear scattered throughout ancient military history, hinting at a much larger, mostly undocumented tradition of biological tactics we may never fully reconstruct. Think about what this tells us about Hannibal specifically. By 184 BC, he was an aging exile, stripped of the armies that once terrified Rome, reduced to advising a minor king in a regional naval conflict most people today have never heard of. And yet, even without ships to match his enemy, even without the resources of Carthage behind him, he still found a way to win. Historians studying his career have pointed out a pattern. Hannibal rarely relied on brute force when a psychological weapon could achieve the same result with fewer losses. The snake pots weren't a desperate gimmick. They were consistent with a strategist who understood, better than almost anyone in the ancient world, that an enemy who panics has already lost the battle before a single sword is drawn. But not every ancient weapon required animals or venom. Sometimes, all it took was a common mineral and a battlefield with wind. Number 5. Quicklime, the weapon that burned without fire. The year is 1217 AD. You're a sailor aboard an English ship during the Battle of Sandwich, watching as your fleet closes in on a French naval force. The wind is at your back, and your commander has just given an order that seems strange until you understand what's about to happen. Barrels of a fine white powder are hauled onto the deck. According to English chronicles from the period, English forces used powdered quicklime, calcium oxide, as a weapon during this naval battle, throwing it into the wind so it would drift directly into the eyes and faces of French sailors. Quicklime reacts violently with moisture, and the human eye is mostly water. The result, according to historical accounts, was chemical burning and temporary or permanent blindness among French crews at a critical moment in the battle, disorienting them just as English ships moved in to attack. Here's what makes this tactic disturbing even by ancient standards. Quicklime wasn't a battlefield discovery. It was a manufactured product, mined, processed, and transported specifically for this purpose. Someone planned this in advance. Someone calculated wind direction, timing, and delivery method before the battle even began. This wasn't improvisation. This was premeditated chemical engineering. But there's a bigger question historians still debate. Some scholars argue Quicklime's effectiveness as a weapon may have been exaggerated in historical accounts, that the psychological impact of blinding powder may have mattered more than its actual chemical effect in real combat conditions, which means we still don't fully know whether this weapon worked exactly as described, or whether medieval chroniclers embellished its power to demonstrate a decisive, righteous victory. But consider the logistics involved, even if only partially accurate. Quicklime is produced by heating limestone to extreme temperatures, a process that requires dedicated kilns, skilled labor, and careful transport, since it reacts violently with any moisture it encounters, including humid sea air. That means someone, well before the battle even began, had to manufacture this substance in bulk, store it in a way that kept it stable, and transport it aboard ships without triggering the very reaction it was designed to cause on the enemy. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of combat. This was supply chain warfare. Chemical weapons manufacturing built into military logistics nearly 800 years ago. Either way, one fact remains undisputed. Someone tried it. And it wasn't the only time fire and chemistry would decide the outcome of a naval battle. Because centuries earlier, in Constantinople, an empire had already perfected something far more terrifying. Number 6. Greek fire, the Byzantine secret weapon. The year is 678 AD. You're aboard a ship approaching the walls of Constantinople, part of a massive Arab naval force laying siege to the greatest city in the Byzantine Empire. Your fleet outnumbers the defenders. Victory should be inevitable. Then you see it. A strange bronze tube mounted on a Byzantine ship, aimed directly at your fleet. What happens next has been described by historians for over 1,000 years, and to this day, no one has fully reconstructed it. A stream of liquid fire erupts from the device, arcing across the water and igniting on contact, even on the surface of the sea itself. This substance became known as Greek fire, and according to Byzantine records, it saved Constantinople from at least 2 major sieges, allowing a numerically inferior force to destroy vastly larger invading fleets. Here's where it gets genuinely mysterious. The formula for Greek fire was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the ancient world. According to historical accounts, knowledge of its exact composition was restricted to the imperial family and a small circle of manufacturers, passed down under conditions of extreme secrecy. The recipe was never fully written down in a form that survived, and when Constantinople eventually fell centuries later, the exact formula was lost. Modern chemists and historians have proposed various combinations involving crude oil derivatives, resins, and other flammable compounds, but every reconstruction attempt has fallen short of matching the described properties, particularly its ability to burn on top of water. Researchers at institutions including the University of Cambridge have spent decades trying to reverse engineer the formula using surviving historical descriptions. None have definitively succeeded. This means an empire, over 1,000 years ago, developed a weapon so effective and so carefully controlled that modern science, with all its tools, still can't fully replicate it. And this raises an unsettling question. If a medieval empire could keep a weapon's formula secret for hundreds of years, hidden well enough that it vanished from history entirely, what does that tell us about what else might have been deliberately erased? Toxic smoke, poisoned arrows, venomous snakes, blinding powder, liquid fire. But the next weapon on this list didn't target soldiers on a battlefield at all. It targeted something far more vulnerable, and its effects could last for generations. Number 7. Poisoned wells. The year is 590 BC. You're a soldier in the army of Athens, participating in what would later be called the First Sacred War, laying siege to the city of Kira. Weeks pass, the city's walls hold. Then your commanders make a decision that historians still discuss with unease. According to ancient accounts, including references preserved by later classical writers, the besieging forces poisoned Kira's water supply using hellebore, a toxic plant known even in antiquity for causing severe illness and death when ingested. The city's defenders, drinking from their own contaminated wells, were struck with violent illness. Weakened, sickened, and unable to mount an effective defense, Kira eventually fell. Here's where this becomes more than just an ancient war story. Poisoning a water supply doesn't just affect soldiers, it affects everyone. Civilians, children, the elderly, anyone who drinks from that well, for as long as the contamination lasts. This makes well poisoning one of the earliest recorded examples of a weapon specifically designed to bypass combatants entirely and strike an entire population indiscriminately. And this is where everything changes, because historians studying ancient siege warfare have found evidence suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident. References to poisoning enemy water sources appear scattered across multiple ancient conflicts, spanning different regions and centuries, suggesting this tactic, while rarely discussed openly in triumphant historical accounts, may have been far more common than the historical record admits. Ancient societies generally condemned well poisoning as dishonorable, even as they occasionally used it, which raises an uncomfortable question historians still can't fully answer. How many ancient sieges that were officially recorded as military victories were actually resolved through poison and simply never written down that way? We may never know the true number. Some of that history may be permanently lost or deliberately left out of the official record by the very people who won those wars. But even poisoned water wasn't the most disturbing biological tactic ancient armies developed. The final weapon on this list didn't use poison at all. It used disease itself. Number 8. Diseased animal remains as biological weapons. The year is 1346 AD. You're standing outside the walls of Kaffa, a fortified trading city on the Black Sea, currently under siege by Mongol forces of the Golden Horde. Something has gone wrong inside the Mongol camp. Soldiers are falling ill in massive numbers. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. The disease spreading through the camp is later understood to be the plague, the same pathogen behind the Black Death that would soon devastate Europe. According to an account written by Genoese notary Gabriele de Musi, the Mongol commanders made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than retreat, they allegedly catapulted the plague-infected corpses of their own dead soldiers over the walls of Kaffa, deliberately introducing disease into the besieged city. Here's where the mystery deepens, because historians are still divided on exactly what happened next. Some researchers argue this event may represent one of the earliest deliberate uses of biological warfare in recorded history, and that plague-infected refugees fleeing Kaffa by ship may have helped carry the disease into Mediterranean ports, contributing to the spread of the Black Death across Europe. Other historians are more cautious, pointing out that fleas carried by rats were the primary vector for plague transmission, and that catapulting corpses over a wall may not have been biologically effective as a direct method of infection, meaning the true impact of this event on the broader pandemic remains genuinely uncertain. But here's the detail that makes this account so unsettling regardless of its precise medical accuracy. Whether or not it worked exactly as described, someone tried it. A medieval army, watching disease destroy their own ranks, made the calculated decision to turn that same disease into a weapon aimed at their enemy. That decision, the intent behind it, represents something historians consider a genuine turning point. It shows an understanding, even without modern germ theory, that disease itself could be deliberately transmitted and weaponized. And that raises the final unresolved question of this entire list. If ancient and medieval people, without microscopes, without any understanding of bacteria or viruses, were already experimenting with biological warfare based purely on observation, what other techniques did they discover, use, and then lose to time? There's a wider pattern historians have noticed across all 8 of these cases. None of them required advanced technology. No gunpowder, no refined chemistry labs, no scientific instruments of any kind. What they required was observation. Watching what happened when sulfur burned in a closed space. Watching what happened when a wound from a certain arrow refused to heal. Watching what happened when disease tore through a military camp. Ancient people didn't need to understand germ theory to weaponize disease. They didn't need to understand toxicology to weaponize venom. They only needed to watch, remember, and apply what they saw. And in some cases, that observation-based knowledge produced weapons so effective, later civilizations spent centuries trying to prohibit them. By the time of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, the modern treaty banning chemical and biological weapons in warfare, humanity was essentially outlawing tactics that armies had already been experimenting with for well over 2,000 years. We didn't invent chemical warfare in the 20th century. We just gave it a name.